Hi there, I hope you're well. This is the last Bible study in our summer series on the book of Daniel. And here is a short video for you to do some further study at home, in your household, in your home group, in your stream, just as a little bit of a follow-up to what we looked at on Sunday morning. Now, this week, for the final week, we are doing Daniel chapter 3. In a slightly funny order. But this week, for the final week, we're doing Daniel chapter 3, which is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's three friends in the fiery furnace. It's one of the most famous stories in the book of Daniel. And in some ways, it kind of parallels what we looked at last week, where we looked at the story of Daniel by himself in the lion's den. Here we have his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those famous Bible characters, finding themselves not going into a den of lions, but thrown into a fiery furnace because of their refusal to worship the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had crafted. And there's loads in this passage, and obviously the background is really interesting because the background is about what it means to stay faithful to the living God in a context whereby Daniel and his friends would be regularly told, oh, well, your God is just kind of one God and there's like loads of gods. And now Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's a God and you just have to kind of bow down and worship him. And the courage they had to say, actually, we won't do that. We can't do that. We can't worship anything other than the one who is worthy of worship. And for the Jewish nation, probably in the first couple of centuries before Jesus' time, who by that point had been, who were being ruled by Rome, by the Roman Empire, these were really important ideas, really important stories. And for the first few generations of Christians, particularly when you get to kind of people like Nero, who would claim themselves as Caesar to be God, to be a son of the gods, and you would have to, the Roman imperial cults, and you would have to pray to Caesar and go to temple and do those kinds of things. So for the Jewish nation and for the very first few generations of Christians, these were really live questions. These were really live issues for them of how they were going to have the courage to say, actually, we won't worship other gods. We won't say that anything other than the living God who made the heavens and earth and who sent his son, Jesus Christ, is the only God, and we won't worship any others. And eventually, the Babylonians, the Persians, and they kind of gave up after a while because and certainly by the time the Romans came along, there was this kind of like grudging acceptance that the awkward Jewish folks were just never going to buy in to this whole other kind of thing that they had going on. And they were never going to allow their God to be kind of added to the pantheon of Greek, Egyptian, Norse, Roman, whatever gods they had going on. They were always going to be going their own path. And it's stories like the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace that were part of shaping that courage and shaping that culture. And there's something for us today whereby we may not worship literal gods, but where the constant invitation is to worship created things rather than the creator, to worship success or wealth or leisure or pleasure or relationships or money or influence or power. Is to put all sorts of other things in the place of God. And so for us, these lessons still have a different kind of resonance. But what I wanted to think about just for a few minutes, which we touched on Sunday, was the story of the fiery furnace as a picture of how we journey through suffering and trial and difficulty. The fact that we all have, for all sorts of different kinds of reasons, fiery furnace experiences, moments in our lives. So your first question is this. Here's your first question with Daniel chapter 3 in mind. What fiery furnace moments have you lived through? Probably not literally, but what moments of suffering and difficulty and trial have you lived through? And obviously in your home group, it's up to you how comfortable you feel to share openly. If you're living with something that's still very live right now, then that's okay. You don't have to talk about that, but you may feel you do want to share, so that's okay too. So you can pause the video and take some time to answer the question, and then press play again, and we will kind of move on a little bit in our thinking. Now, for us in the modern world, suffering is awful. It's really bad. We believe that we should be able to live without pain, to live without suffering. The modern world is set up on the idea that life is about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, being able to live your best life, follow your dreams, follow your heart, and suffering and difficulty limit us. They prevent us from being able to do whatever we want. And so suffering becomes a real problem, and for modern people. And that's why when you talk to people who aren't Christians, who haven't taken that step, one of the questions they will just come back to again and again is why is suffering? Why is there suffering in the world? And it's a question, obviously every generation has wrestled with that question, but in the kind of the pre-modern world, suffering was just assumed to be part of life. And the question was not why is there suffering? The question is what does God do about suffering? How does God deal with the reality of suffering? And yet, for the very first generation of Christians living in a different time, suffering was something to be what would the right word be? It was something to be accepted and understood as something that God could use to bring about good in our lives. And there are all sorts of examples for that. But there's a particular passage in James I want to read to you in a minute, written by James, the brother of Jesus. And we shouldn't be surprised about that, because as we explored on Sunday, at the heart of Christianity is the idea that the very best person who ever lived suffered the worst thing imaginable. And if that's at the heart of Christianity, and if redemptive suffering is at the heart of the cross, then we shouldn't be surprised that for the very first generation of Christians, they saw God acting in their own suffering in powerful and profound ways. And so James, the brother of Jesus, wrote these words. This is James chapter 1. Consider it, these are great words, but here we go. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And this is this wonderful idea about how the furnace of our suffering becomes the forge of our faith. That experiences that we think are, furnace experiences, just awful things that happen to us, maybe as a consequence of our own actions, our own decisions, or maybe just something terrible that happens, a little bit like for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, something completely out of their control happens to them, and they find themselves in a moment of pain and persecution and suffering. And yet for James, those moments should not be resisted, as it were, not kind of run away from, because those are moments in which the furnace of suffering can become the forge of faith. That actually through them, God can grow us, grow who we are, grow our character, and make us more complete people, complete in his grace because of what we go through. So here's the second question. And reflecting on the fiery furnace moments that you've already talked about. Here's the second question. Can you take any positives from those moments? Can you take any positives from them? Can you look back on them and see, actually, it was pretty awful, but yet God used that for good in this way? And if so, what positives could you take from them? That's not to deny the fact that those things really happened. But can you see the redemptive work of God in your fiery furnace moment? So once again, you can hit pause and then we'll come back just for a few final reflections in just a moment. Suffering and difficulty and trial are one of the universal realities of human life. We all go through it at some point, go through something. Maybe when we're young, maybe it's not till we get a little bit older and our health begins to break down, or some unexpected difficulties come in the second half of life. But none of us get out of here alive. We will all live through moments of suffering. And I think one of the things that's really been on my heart this year is to think about how do we help people to journey through suffering well. We are in a moment of global suffering, a moment of global difficulty, and it's it's as they say, a crisis is it's a real shame to waste a crisis. It's a real shame to kind of not just try and see what the Lord might be doing in it. So the question then is, what attitude do we take into these experiences? What attitude do we kind of gird ourselves with, either in the midst of suffering or just in our general life, so that we can negotiate these things well and kind of come out of it really well? Because I think it is the attitude that we take into these moments that determines how well we journey through them and how much God can work in us. And of course, in Daniel chapter 3, we have the incredible example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the attitude that they took into their experience and the experience of the fiery furnace. And I want to read to you what they say just before it happened. They say this. This is Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. King Neb, we wouldn't change a thing. We know this is going to cause us all sorts of trouble, but we wouldn't change a thing because we know that we are walking with God. But if we are thrown into the fiery furnace, the blazing furnace, with the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. What an incredible attitude, what incredible words. And they are words of statements of faith and trust. And what I love about them is they focus not on getting out of this, but they focus on getting through it. And they don't presume a certain outcome. They don't say, oh yeah, we know that God's going to take care of us. And I think sometimes Christians do that. We go, oh, well, God will take care of us. And then when, if it doesn't work out like that, we kind of then, our faith gets really shaken. They don't presume an outcome. They say, well, God can deliver us. He can deliver us from the fiery furnace and from you. But he may not. And yet we trust him enough that even if he doesn't, we are going to keep walking with him. And we are not going to go back to worshipping you or your dumb statue. And so we looked at this a little bit on Sunday as the attitude that we take into suffering, but that helps get us through it. But here is your final question, and I think you can go perhaps a little bit broader than what we touched on Sunday, which is this. How would you describe the attitude that with which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went into that furnace experience, that experience of suffering and persecution? How would you describe their attitude? What kind of attitude what lessons might we take from that for the furnace experiences that we have in life? So that's the final question. I hope you enjoy your time together discussing these things. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to engage meaningfully and deeply with Scripture. And I will see you soon.